point, just so everyone knows I'm in it. We affirm resolve. The United States ought to replace the Electoral College with a direct national popular vote. Contention 1 is a flawed system. The Electoral College gives a true power of decision to a small portion of the population. Kimball of the University of Kansas O2 explains that the Electoral College forces presidential candidates to concentrate their resources on a small number of competitive states, while ignoring states that appear solidly to favor one camp or the other, because a candidate who is already well ahead in a particular state gets no bonus for carrying that state in an even wider margin. In fact, Silver 538 quantified in 2014 that under the Electoral College, 9 states are 70 times more powerful than the rest of the country. As a result, Parker of Stanford 16 finds that 4 out of 5 Americans exercise no real electoral voice in the presidential election due to the Electoral College. There are 2 impacts. First is special favors. Gillen of Purdue 16 explains that the Electoral College creates an incentive for presidential candidates and incumbents to improve their electoral prospects by directing policy favors to battleground states. Specifically, Koza explains that battleground states receive 7% more presidentially controlled grants, twice as many disaster declarations, considerably more exemptions, and numerous other favorable actions from presidents. Switching to the national popular vote solves that. Ealing of Wayne State University O2 finds that a popular vote election would make presidents more likely to pursue a truly national interest in their policy platform, leading Parker 16 to conclude that no single reform would deliver more on this promise than eliminating the Electoral College. The second impact is turnout. Silverstein 17 explains that people in spectator states believe that since the outcome of their state is virtually already decided, their vote does not matter. Thus, a Republican in Massachusetts or Democrat in Tennessee chooses not to vote because their vote is essentially wasted. This is why he finds that turnout is 11% lower in spectator states, a margin that continues to increase. Unfortunately, the impacts of low turnout for presidential elections extend into state, congressional, and local elections as well. Macedo 05 explains that political cynicism and the belief that voting doesn't truly impact the direction of policy causes voters to have little motive to head to the polls in local and state-level elections. However, as Grant 16 of NSU explains, it's these local and state elections that impact citizens' everyday lives in terms of infrastructure, transportation, schooling, and more. A national popular vote would solve that for this harm, as Cart finds in note 6 that in a system where citizens feel like their vote matters, there's a 12% higher turnout rate. Contention 2 is power of minorities. The Electoral College severely decreases the political power of racial minorities in 2 ways. First is the focus on swing states. Jones of Fortune finds in 16 that swing states are disproportionately white. There are roughly 15 so-called swing states, and of those 15 states, 10 of them have more white voters than the national average, while minorities are clustered in spectator states such as California and New York. This leads Gelman to find that whites have 16% more power than blacks once the Electoral College is taken into consideration, 28% more power than Latinos, and 57% more power than those who fall into any other category. Second is voter suppression. Raskin of American University 08 explains that the Electoral College creates an incentive for strategic niche shift by partisan actors in battleground states, who need only to suppress a relatively small number of votes to swing all of the state's electors and thereby potentially the entire election. The impact of voter suppression disproportionately falls on minorities. Hudgenall of UCSD 17 quantifies that when comparing states with and without strict voter ID laws, Hispanic turnout is 8.3 percentage points lower, Asian turnout is 5 points lower, and Black turnout is 2.2 points lower in stricter states. Switching to the national popular vote would decrease both the political incentive and the legal ability for states to implement these laws. This is because Lehman of Florida Atlantic University 05 writes that any type of popular vote system would likely require national rather than state and local control over who votes and how people vote in order to ensure that all votes count the same throughout the country. Rejecting every instance of racism is important because according to many, to accept a racist universe to even the slightest degree is to endorse fear, injustice, and violence. One cannot found a moral order, let alone a legislative order on racism, because racism subjects sectors of society to violence and domination, which is why he concludes that fixing the structures of systemic racism is always a prerequisite to conductive society and effective democracy. Thus, we affirm.
Can we see one of the opinions? The 7% policy favor. Cool. That's fine. Thank you. 2 seconds.
Is that already ready? All my judges. Green Valley negates. Contention 1 is media madness. The media is dominated by pervasive horse race coverage that portrays candidates as celebrities rather than focusing on the facts. Fortune lictor of George Mason University in 12 observes that due to declining revenues and vanishing consumers, news outlets will have to shift coverage away from a horse race style coverage. This is empirically corroborated by Stacko in 17, who finds that coverage on strategy receives fewer views per page as the status quo is against horse race coverage. Problematically, a direct popular vote will reverse this, as Hershey of Indiana University in 2 explains that a change in electoral rules would tempt reporters to focus on how the game changes, generating an ongoing supply of material that reignites the horse race. Slanted coverage is detrimental to democracy for 2 reasons. First, it creates a polarized electorate, because the media focuses on the most heated and dividing parts of politics rather than the actual issues. Lewandowski and of Pennsylvania quantifies in 2011 that exposure to this media reduces support for bipartisanship and compromise in policymaking by 44%. This has implications in the government, as Horowitz, University of Maryland, finds in 06 that increasing ideological differences in the electorate encourages more ideologically extreme policy stances by elected representatives. Second, it reduces trust in government. Kornbluth of USC explains in 12 that because media injects cynicism in potential voters, soundbite-driven campaign coverage lowers the confidence and satisfaction of everyday Americans with government. Contention 2 is sparking an uproar. Implementing a direct popular vote would incentivize politicians to take advantage of the process, destroying the function of our government in 3 ways. First, by inciting partisan backlash. Here at the University of Kansas explains in 2002 that because electoral changes may have an impact on who is advantaged or disadvantaged by the new rules, the parties are risk-averse to change. Gaines at the University of Illinois thus finds in 10 that any electoral reform that is sold as a nonpartisan measure, but is in fact supported almost exclusively by one party, would ignite intense opposition as an attempt to cheat in future elections. He further that the direct popular vote initiative is seen as pro-democratic. Thus, the GOP would likely use this change as an excuse to engage in intense obstructionism in order to demonstrate the ineffectiveness of government under the Democrats' new system. As Edgar of the University of Wisconsin writes in 15, there is strong electoral incentive to obstruct policy initiatives and fuel significant partisan conflict in Congress. Second, by expanding negative ads. Hopkins of the University of California, Berkeley in 8 explains that under the Electoral College, candidates only pay for ads in the 15 swing states. However, Michener of UC Swarthmore in 16 explains that a national popular vote would result in a shift in campaign strategy, as candidates would have to appeal to a national market. Michener furthers that because of a shift to a national market, a direct popular vote would result in campaigns being done largely through television advertisements. Empirically, Gordon of Northwestern University in 16 estimates that a shift to a direct popular vote would increase exposure to advertisements by 13%. Unfortunately, Franz of the Washington State University in 07 quantifies that 7 out of 10 advertisements in presidential elections are considered negative. This polarizes the electorate, as Iyengar of Stanford University in 8 explains that exposure to a single negative advertisement increases polarization by 14% because you force individuals to vote off of candidates' weakness as opposed to their strengths. Third, by incentivizing base-centered campaigning. Moore of the Freedom Foundation in 09 finds that the Electoral College results in candidates having to appeal to swing states, which forces only moderate candidates to gain this kind of support as it draws politics towards the middle. Unfortunately, Caldera of the University of Mississippi finds in 2013 that the national popular vote, on the other hand, would force campaigns to energize their respective party bases in order to drive out turnout among supporters, thereby ignoring millions of independent and swing voters and leading to an even more polarized electorate. There are 2 impacts to the polarization of American politics. First, it incapacitates policymaking. Because polarization decreases negotiation, Epstein of the Rand Corporation quantifies in 2007 at the least polarized congressional term produced 166% more legislation than did the most polarized terms. Moreover, Cole, the University of Georgia, finds in 16 that many policies aimed at the poor require continuous legislative adjustment to achieve a constant level of social protection. Thus, Barbara of Princeton University qualifies in 2013 that polarization harms public policy as it does not adjust to changing economic and demographic circumstances, leaving citizens vulnerable. Second, it breeds a domestic crisis. Barbara furthers that partisan polarization causes the government to postpone the handling of important issues such as reform to entitlements and fiscal crises. This is critical because Ray, the University of Missouri, observed in 08 that the longer policymakers wait to institute reforms to sectors such as the economy and the environment, the greater the severity of the recession and to climate change is. Thus, we can see nothing but a negative balance.
Can I see, so let's talk about your first contention, first impact, where you say polarization leads to an increase in extreme policies.
Yep.
So your assumption is polarization would increase on both sides, so more Democrats, more Republicans, more strongly for their base.
Yeah, and we say that leads to less policies passed in Congress.
Right. So would you say that right now the Congress is pretty polarized?
I'd argue that we're going to read evidence in the Pew Research Center that finds in the last 60 years, polarization has stayed relatively constant and relatively to low levels where policy is still being passed in Congress, which we say could get a lot lower.
Why would you consider polarization currently too low? Low in terms of?
Well, low in terms of the fact that there's still a high yield of policy rate. In fact, we'll read evidence that finds that the Trump administration under his first 100 days passed more policy than any president since the Kennedy administration.
Right, but we've had 5 near government shutdowns and 1 actual government shutdown in the last 4 years.
Right, and I'd argue like that was
Do
probably
you think
worse
we
in
could
the past.
probably get less polarized than that?
I'd argue we can get a lot more polarized than we are now. Do you mind if I have a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so on your first impact, your first contention, you talk about how swing states are receiving more grants, right? the evidence you read doesn't say that these grants are for things like natural disasters and things that these states simply receive because they're more prone to like basically things like tornadoes and hurricanes.
No, it actually specifically says that they're getting more grants because they're battleground states.
It says they receive more disaster relief aid. So why is disaster relief aid somehow linked to Electoral College? Shouldn't they get these grants anyways?
Right, so here's the issue. The card doesn't say that they need these grants. It says it's only getting these grants because of the pure fact that they're battleground states. What we're saying is that this grant, whether or not it's necessary, is unfair because it's not going to states who could potentially actually need it and going to battleground states for the pure reason that they're battleground states. But if you want to give you more examples of policy, I can do that right now.
That's fine. You can ask a question.
Yeah, so let's talk about your second intention, your negative ads, where you say that 7 out of 10 ads are negative and that negative ads increase polarization.
Yep.
Other than, so would you say that overall campaign advertising is a bad thing or just negative ads are a bad thing?
Well, we say is that since the majority of these ads that are aired, especially when you switch to national popular vote, because the primary method of campaigning would be national
So are campaign ads inherently bad, or is it when they become negative?
Negative advertising. But since 7 out of 10 are, and the trend is even towards a greater proportion of those ads, we'd say that that influences for American politics.
Yeah.
Okay, so in your second impact, you talk about how there's higher turnout in swing states compared to safe states. In the 2012 election, because your analysis looks at the 2008 election, out of the top 6 states that were top turnout states, how many of those were actually battleground states?
You clearly want to answer
Yeah,
yourself,
so only 1 out of the 5 top turnout states were in fact swing states.
That's fine. And what we're saying is like the national averages is that there's 11% more turnout.
That was looking at the 2008 election, and moreover, like I'd argue that swing states.
Before elections.
Well, you said him from 2008, so he looked at elections before the 2012
Right, he looked at 4
right?
elections before 2008. So like, sure, in some elections, some states will have low turnout, some states will have high turnout, but nationally, on average, the general trend is that swing states have 11% higher turnout.
Right, but if swing states switch from year to year and go to places like Iowa, Pennsylvania switch from a swing state, doesn't that indicate that it doesn't really matter?
Problematic. In fact, the Hill tells you that swing states are changing, they're actually decreasing. For example, in 1980, we had around 20 battleground states. Now we have less than 8. They expect it to go down to 6 in election, 4, 2, 1. Essentially, battleground states are changing. Well, I guess they're changing in that they're becoming less.
Am I allowed to have this?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, what's your next question?
On media madness. 2 responses to the link. First, a popular vote would decrease the need for advertising because it would end what 538 in 2016 calls the horse race media coverage of the polls in swing states. By switching away from this kind of journalism, a popular vote opens up more policy-based discussions, decreasing the need for horse race coverage. Ultimately, their impact at the end of this contention is that for a short period of time, they're going to focus on the change from a national popular vote from Electoral College to a national popular vote. We're going to outweigh on time frame because at the end of the day, this is very short-lived. After 50 or 100 years, when we adapt to the national popular vote system, there won't be this kind of coverage. But second, the brokenness of the Electoral College already fuels the controversy and polarization they talk about. We should affirm on the risk of making the situation better. The existence of the Electoral College itself fuels controversy. CBS News reports in 2016 that Donald Trump's Electoral College win, despite losing the popular vote, is fueling a growing movement of outrage. Even worse, Reuters reports in 2016 that large-scale violent protests have broken out in response to the perceived illegitimacy. The impacts are first polarization. There's 2 responses. First, an increase in turnout with a national popular vote solves. Silverstein tells you when we make everyone feel like their vote matters, they're going to turn out more. In the status quo, people don't turn out because they don't feel like their vote matters, which is why swing states have 11% higher turnout than non-swing states. McElwain and Al Jazeera finds in 2015 that higher voter turnout forces candidates to the middle because with every state now in play, both parties will be forced to fight for the moderate vote. But second, the nature of the national popular vote candidates would be more moderate. Hartman of Stanford indicates that because television ads become more expensive, since all would have to be employed at the national level, candidates would look for other ways to get votes by adopting more popular policy positions that are then adopted by the media. But then second, on trust. We would argue trust is already too low for any more decrease in trust to be significant. In fact, Grant of Nova Southeastern University explains in 2016, the reason people think their vote doesn't matter is that presidents consistently fail to live up to their campaign promises because they appeal to swing states and not the entire election. This is crucial, not the entire nation. This is crucial because Silverstein tells you that when they feel like their votes don't matter, they don't turn out to vote, which is why we see 11% lower voter turnout in spectator states versus swing states, and which is why the Electoral College is fueling mistrust in the status quo. Go to contention 2 on uproar. We would argue, let's go to their first argument on partisan backlash. First, they say Republicans will block Democrats, but we would argue this is already happening with an Electoral College. Manouche makes this analysis in Crossfire. Says Congress has been the most gridlocked and useless it has been in the last 5 years. You should affirm on the risk of making the situation better. They can't tell you why a more gridlocked government would be bad because they don't give you a threshold for when when their impacts are going to materialize. But second, on negative ads, there's two responses here. There's actually a couple responses here. First, their link to negative ads is essentially only 15 swing states get negative ads in the status quo. However, their evidence actually says that by the end of the election cycle, only 15 states get the majority of ads, so they don't really fully link into their increase. But second, turn the argument. Increasing advertising leads to an increase in voter turnout. According to Harvard in 2005, exposure to advertising is and fourth, Brooks of Politics and Gender finds that negative ads increase the probability of voting by 77% because they don't let people know something is wrong. They let people know something is wrong and give them an incentive to go out and fix it through voting. Fifth and finally, they're going to come up here and read a meta-analysis looking at all the literature on negative ads and say that 65% of articles on the topic indicate that negative ads depress turnout. However, Lau GW analyzed that Brookings meta-analysis and concluded that none of those conclusions were actually accurate. But then, let's go on their third argument on base-centered campaigning. A couple responses. First, James Warren of US News finds that the Electoral College doesn't actually appeal to moderates, meaning the status quo does not solve. He finds that in swing states, parties don't appeal to moderates, they just go to appeal to their base in that swing state. But second, Fiorina finds that 40% of Americans are ideologically moderate, more than, and then the rest are split 30-30. In the world of the national popular vote, it is mathematically not feasible to win a national popular vote without going for moderates. And third and finally, the national popular vote solves because COSA finds that the 50 largest urban areas in the US, where the majority of the Democratic base is, comprise only 15% of the population. When you add urban and suburban areas together, the US Census Bureau finds that's 80% of the population, meaning with a national popular vote, they would go for more people. All the problems they give you in case are not unique to the NPV, instead they're happening under the Electoral College, meaning they have a 100% probability of happening right now, and negating does not change that. You vote out on the risk of making the problem better.
Okay. So that said, let's begin. The first piece of evidence that they try to read you is 538 that explains that by switching to a national popular vote, you would effectively get rid of the horse race. The problem is that the risk of voting out you should vote off it because the risk of actually solving the horse race is better. But they don't respond to the two uniqueness evidence that we read at the top of the case. The first is lecture that the horse race is not being covered in the status quo. So there is no risk of solvency argument if the risk is not even present in the status quo. But specifically though, we would also trump the argument because we explained according to George Washington University that this would be a long-term effect. Because what would happen is that candidates would cover what happened in the national popular vote versus what would have happened under the Electoral College. At the point where that's systematically true, you turn the response back against them. Then they give you two reasons as to why our impact is not unique. The first is turnout. The internal link is the perception of vote matters. So at any point, this is also unique to the second impact of their first contention, so this response applies to all. Henry Hendricks of the University of Minnesota conducted an analysis in which they tested the hypothesis that candidates people who don't live in swing states, whether or not they perceive their vote matters, and what they find is there's no statistically significant difference if you live in a swing state and you perceive that your vote actually matters, so you delink them on base. That's why empirically turnout doesn't actually increase in swing states. But then the second thing they say is that they get other impacts to vote, that because it's going to cost more money, they're going to turn to other mechanisms. Turn the response. Garcia Mendes of the University of Pennsylvania explains that they're going to turn to free media, and free media is worse because they form more extreme policy positions. This is a unique turn on their case because Michael Berber explains in 2014 is that when they turn to more extreme policy positions, it leads to more polarization in government. This is another link into the impact of polarization. Then they say is that there's no impact in response to my contention too. They try to put this no threshold argument. However, there's two problems. First, the Pew Research Center explains that overall is that there's been a relatively constant rate of polarization over the past 60 years, so it can get systematically worse. But secondly, the Trump administration uniquely, not only 538 explains that they passing those policies under Congress in the first 100 days, and secondly, Dallas Tribune explains is that Trump's actually going to decrease ideological positions because sure he has certain extreme policies, but on net he actually favors policies that benefit both Republicans and Democrats, so it forces cooperation. So I think when that is true, we can win the risk of a solvency argument, and then specifically on the argument about negative advertisements, you're going to extend the analysis that even if they win any sort of turn, they don't actually respond specifically to analysis. Negative advertisements lead to a 14% increase in polarization, so you extend that link evidence. But then specifically, the meta-analysis they're talking about is actually really fun. It literally said none of the conclusions were supported by my earlier 1993 article. He goes in 2006 and reverses it. Their own evidence says it says 65% of holistic scholarly literature literally says that negative advertisements actually decrease turnout. So you turn the Harvard University evidence and you turn the Brooks evidence against them. Then lastly, here is problematic because it only looks at spending by politicians, but then looks at actual spending. So the University of Houston explains is that negative advertisements are 14% more likely to actually be false. But then specifically on their case, contention 1 talks about a false system. The internal link, this slide that goes specifically to the impacts. First of all, the impact's not unique because you looked at the fact that there's actually no statistical correlation. In fact, Smith of the Election Law Journal 2008 finds in analysis of campaign speeches is that candidates don't actually tailor their policies to swing states. It empirically is not true. But secondly, this is simply cherry-picked. Marcos Machado of UCLA conducted research in 2012 in which to look at more than 20 years of election data and found there's no correlation between being a swing state and getting more federal policies. Their 7% analysis is literally specific to disaster relief, but I would argue that that's because of Hurricane Katrina, not anything else. But then, The second impact talks about voter turnout. The problem is that voter turnout, if you cross-apply the response that the perception of your vote doesn't matter, that's why Trent England finds that there's no correlation between swing state and having higher turnout. And this article actually looked at 3 different elections. They can't even provide me with their methodology. Then, contention 2 talks about minorities. So, the first thing talks about swing states. First, Charlie Harkin, the Associated Press estimates that since 2000, swing states become 93% less white. The second, William Fry, the Brooks Institute, explains that during the same time period, swing states became 45% more Hispanic and 90% more African Americans. So much so that Fry estimates that minorities actually have a significant voting bloc that can actually influence elections and influence the way that candidates are spent. So you turn the eternally. That's why Delman and Columbia University explains is that they have actually more influence under the Electoral College. Then we'll think about voter suppression. First, mitigate the impact. Only less than 20 states actually have this, so there's no sufficient impact in the minority representation. Second, Valor of UC Riverside explains historically that instances of voter fraud actually increases voter ID laws. That's why Rosenthal and George Washington University explains that there would be more voter ID laws under the national popular vote, so you flip the impact. But if anything though, the risk that it would happen in all 50 states outweighs the happening in less than 20 states, so the risk that it happens in the negative world outweighs the case.
Was there a horse race election in 2016?
I would say yes, but
so like, what's the probability of your impact of like no horse races in the status quo action?
So one, Legislature explains in 2012 is that the trend right now is against horse race coverage, and then Business Insider explains is that the Trump election was the tipping point.
Hold on, have we actually seen this materialize?
Yeah, Scacco 2015 that you don't, or actually 2017 just says he looks at online news publications and he found that it's not profitable to have horse race coverage.
Why
so what he
not?
finds that because it's because of declining viewership, all of the above. So the Business Insider evidence explains is that Trump is a unique tipping point against horse race coverage.
Okay. Here's another question.
Yes. Okay. So you read this argument in your first contention about how it's a flawed system, and you say there's like a 7% increase in policy favors. So I have a couple of questions. First, when I'm looking to policy favors, that was looking after the 2004 election, correct?
No, it was analyzing like the last.
No, that was Silverstein, but that was like the other part is a different piece of evidence. That's the only quantification evidence. So my question then is like, what specific policies were passed in swing states that didn't actually were passed on a national basis?
Like what we're arguing, the crux of our argument is that the national campaign is centered around swing state issues. For example, 60% of Americans don't support free trade. Support free trade. However, because 10 out of 11 major swing states are Rust Belt states and they're against free trade, a lot of the policies in the election and a lot of the policies passed after. Right. I don't have a name of a policy, but I'm telling you the entire platform of the candidates that run in the election revolve around the interests of swing states, and that's what disincentivizes voters to come out and vote.
So just on a blame level, though. Yeah.
Wait. All right. So what is the time frame of your first contention?
Okay. Well, the George Washington University evidence says that at least would happen for like a few elections in the system.
So like,
and I say that's important though because
16 years maybe.
Because we read inherency evidence that says is that right now it's against the horse race. So any just writs that it comes back as bad.
Why?
But because of the fact that you even extend the impacts as to why it's bad. Then you also, let's talk about this for a second though. You try to read this response to like advertisements, is that they would turn to other mechanisms to get votes. So is that like free media, right?
No,
does that incentivize, how do you get free media?
No, my argument is that they would adopt more popular policy positions to get votes because they know that they give the moderates.
Wait, how would they get those positions here to the average person?
Well, there's free media coverage.
Free media coverage, right? So if they wanted to get more free media coverage in response to advertisements, our evidence indicates that they would turn to more extreme positions. An example is Trump. Trump got way more free media.
That's fine, right? But we tell you that with a national popular vote, it's mathematically impossible for an extremist candidate
let's talk
to win
about
the election.
Like the moderate argument that you make in response to my third one. Okay, so when you say that 40 to 60% of voters are moderate, if campaigns...
No, I didn't say, I said 40%.
Okay, 40%, okay. But so like if campaigns though are only targeting like base voters, wouldn't the rest of the moderate voters then shift over?
No, we tell
Yale
you
University says is that if base center campaigning happened, then these voters would just shift and become more extreme.
Right, if base center campaigning happens, but we
it would though.
Why?
Because right now they only focus on moderate voters in swing states. That's why by definition
we tell you there are no moderate voters in swing states. Swing states are divided.
Are you kidding me? They're
no, I'm not
kidding
you.
States.
Swing states are divided Republican and Democrat. All they do in swing states is appeal to the base in that state and hope that they swing that state because it's divided equally.
Okay, the Calgary evidence speaks to that.
Media madness, two main things. First of all, the media wants to make profit. That's their main goal. So if they say that there's no profit in horse race coverage, they're not going to do horse race coverage ever. But secondly, 538 tells you that if anything, national popular vote decreases horse race coverage in the long run because it decreases the pressure on every single individual race and makes it one really big one. So that means we delink their impact. us, no one would say that Congress right now is doing really well if not polarized. We see that there's no bright line and it's getting worse. Secondly, on negative ads, we have a couple of trends. First, we tell you that ads increase voting, the chance of voting. Then we tell you negative ads have more information. And lastly, we tell you that negative ads increase the chance of voting by 77%. But lastly, on base support, the most important response we make is that Free Arena says that 40% of voters are moderate. So statistically, mathematically, in order to win the vote, you have to appeal to those moderates. With that being said, two voting issues. The first of which is the flawed system. We tell you that in the status quo, Electoral College focus is on 9 states, which is why Silver tells you that they have 7 times more power than the rest of the population. And there's 2 impacts. First, the special favors. An example we talked about in Crossfiber was the Rust Belt. For example, the Rust Belt states do not support a free economy. However, the rest of the country generally does, and yet we don't have a free trade at the level that we would like because of the fact that those candidates appeal to swing states. But the second and bigger impact that they ignore is turnout. Silverstein specifically tells you that swing states have 11% higher turnout than battleground states because in non-swing states they believe that their votes don't matter. The impact is that this political cynicism goes down into local and state elections, which is important because Grant tells you those are the elections that actually make a difference on citizens' lives. But the second way we're winning today's round is minorities. They tell you that swing states are becoming less white. That's wonderful, that's great. However, whites still have 57% more power than every other minority group. And then voter suppression. We tell you that under the national popular vote, they lose the incentive and the ability to enact voter ID laws, which is really important because they disproportionately affect minorities. At the end of the day, national popular votes, at the end of the day, Manny tells you that racism is always going to be a prerequisite to any moral and logistical order because it is a prerequisite to a good democracy. That's me third.
We'll take prep time.
Polarization outweighs because turnout in the world where polarization high is on net bad because the polarized electorate votes for candidates and policies that aren't going to be beneficial for them, and if you can't actually pass policy in Congress, you're not actually impacting any lives. That's why it comes first. Then on their case, go to minorities, except the Associated Press, which post-haste analysis to find minorities have grown up to 90% in swing states, which is why Gelman turns their impact and finds that minorities are a stronger voting bloc under the Electoral College. The warrant is simple on a national level. Minorities are just that, a minority. When you concentrate them in states that matter most in the election, you ensure that candidates pay attention to their needs. They try to extend the 57% evidence, but that's literally comparing them in swing states. That whites have 57% more power. That doesn't give you a comparative analysis. What would be under the national popular vote? Under the national popular vote, whites would have literally 80% more power because minorities make up 20 to 30% within the nation, so comparatively, the Electoral College is better. Then on policy skew, extend Engels, who said that even in swing state candidates talk about national moderate issues and don't pander policies, which is why the UCLA evidence concludes analyzing 30 years of presidential actions, which post-states and encompasses theirs and more evidence that there's no correlation between swing states and favors, and they don't even really impact that out to why that's important. But then on turnout, 2 responses. First, extend Trent Engel, who looks at 20 years of elections and finds that swing states don't actually have more turnout because the idea that people think their vote doesn't count isn't actually something people actually believe. Since swing states have changed in the past, they realize that they still have a voice. But the second way we link it to turnout is through negative advertisements. Remember, 7 out of 10 advertisements are negative, and the Lau analysis, which post-dates theirs and is a better analysis that takes into account many studies, finds that the majority of negative ads, in fact, decrease political turnout by a staggering 14%. That's crucial because that links into the turnout argument, so we're actually seeing more of that in our world. But then, on our case about base turnout. That's the second way we link it to polarization. This is really key because their only response is that there's more moderates on a national scale, but that doesn't answer the fact that moderates on swing state basis have control over what kind of policies, the policies that a candidate is going to go for. Remember, the Cordell evidence finds that when you have to pander to the moderates within swing states, which you wouldn't have to under national popular vote, because then you just try to do a turnout election, which means you're basically going to your base, people like Democrats and Republicans trying to turn those people out, that doesn't actually change your policy. That's why we access Epstein and Rand, who said in 70 finds that when you have a less polarized electorate, they're going to elect less polarized candidates in Congress, which means you have 160% more policies being passed in the world where this isn't happening.
That they elected a president who wants things like a border wall,
Well,
even though they won the Congress.
A couple things. Like one, William Fry of the Brookings Institute explains is that they have a significant voting bloc right now and that they will influence future elections.
Why haven't they influenced elections
So
already?
they had it now, but they didn't have it 4 months ago? And during the election?
Secondly,
Why?
I would argue
Wait,
that
hold on, why?
Wait, what?
No, I'd say like the Trump election wasn't a fact that like minorities weren't a strong base, right? Like even
Because if
white
anything,
liberal Democrats were outnumbered because
Trump election is
Trump
Trump
ran a base turnout campaign, which was like
If anything,
Not
an anomaly.
indicative of
if anything, the 2016 election proves that minorities have a stronger voting bloc towards the popular vote.
I think the problem though with that analysis is simple. Is that like you're giving a false comparison. So like for example, the only statistic you read is that like they're 57% more white, or they have whites have 57% more voting power.
Yes.
That's looking specifically to swing states.
No, it's
it
not.
doesn't give comparative
It's not.
analysis between the direct popular
No,
vote
no,
and the
no.
Electoral College.
No, it's saying that as a whole, the whole country, whites have 57% more power.
Okay.
The reason is swing states, however,
But it
it's
doesn't
on the
give
whole country.
comparative analysis. The Gimple of Columbia University evidence that we
give comparative
read.
analysis to something that hasn't been implemented.
No, it can. Our evidence gives a simulation that says is that a national popular vote would actually, the Electoral College actually statistically is better for minority voters.
Yeah,
because how many
for example,
minorities are in the
Nevada.
United States, and then say
Because white
whites
voters,
are not going to get as much.
white voters have a 50% greater electoral sway under the Electoral College, right? But under the national popular vote, it would be even higher, something like 70 or 80%.
Yeah, and like you look to my home state of Nevada, right? We voted Democrat previously. We voted Republican because the Hispanic population is growing.
Here's the difference. In a national popular vote, minorities sure are the minority. However, there are Democrats that are white Democrats and white Republicans, so that they get their vote. However, what Memi tells you is that because the Electoral College is inherently racist, the fact that the institution itself is racist, we must reject it.
Why is it racist?
And which you haven't responded to ever in today's round.
Why is institution?
Would you like the question?
I think the problem with like Memi is a couple of things.
Okay,
Wait,
wait.
you can't have a problem with Memi, right?
It's way too late.
It's like
No, because the reason you use Memi as an impact is because you say there's less minority
Wait,
representation
it's
in the
way too
Electoral
late to
College.
respond to Memi. Would you like the question that's
So
actually
like,
conducted?
we can't
No,
engage in
we
debate
answer
because you said
we answer your minority argument, which is why you can impact out Memi.
Can we engage in a discourse? Like, why
How about
I
you
think
ask us
Memi?
a question instead?
Okay. So if policy on net doesn't get passed, then on net, every single person on scope, every single state is not getting impacted. Correct.
Right, but never do say that no policy is ever going to
Well,
be passed.
166% fewer policies.
But we take out your link.
With how?
So a couple ways. First, we tell you that they're not going to do
That's-
horse race politics. Second, we tell you
Okay.
that partisans already pretty bad. Remaining 15 seconds of time.
turnout argument and then two voters. So the access polarization through base turnout. They say that the national popular vote, the candidates would pander more to their base. They don't respond adequately to Fiorina, who says that 40% of America is moderate. At the end of the day, it's mathematically impossible to win the national popular vote by only pandering to the base. But then, when you look at the polarization impact, consistently, we've told you, polarization is already high. They can't actually garner a huge impact off of this because they don't give you a threshold as to when their impacts are going to materialize. We tell you Congress is already inactive. There's no reason why to prefer the status quo. There's two voters in this round. And the most important impact should be representation. The two voters, first, is turnout. Silver tells you that 9 states have 70 times more power than the entire country. That's why Stanford finds that 4 out of 5 voters feel as if they don't have a say in the election. The impact is turnout. Silverstein tells you that when voters feel like they don't have a say in the election, they don't turn out to vote. And when he does a comparative analysis, he finds that voters in non-swing states are 11% lower than voter turnout in non-swing states is 11% lower than in swing states. And they say there's no significant difference, but they don't actually give you empirics on this. You prefer our analysis. That's really important because Macedo finds that if they don't vote in national elections, they also don't vote in local elections. And SU tells you the local elections are the most important. This is dropped analysis, and that's how we access our carbon impact. This is a 12% higher turnout with a national popular vote. But the cleanest way we're winning this round is on minorities. There's 2 ways we access, and the first is swing state. They say the swing state minority turnout is increasing. That's fine. But Gelman tells you that when you look overall to the past 16 years of election cycles, swing states are still disproportionately white, and whites have 57% more power than minorities. Not that they have more representation, more power, and that's more impactful. But B is suppression laws. They drop this in summary. It's a clean extension for us. We tell you Raskin finds that it incentivizes voter ID laws with an electoral college, and the UCSD finds that leads to lower minority turnout. Niven finds that a national popular vote solves, and the reason this is the most important impact is they drop Memi this entire round. Memi tells you that racism is the most important impact. You have to reject every instance of racism before looking at policy, and that's why policy and polarization aren't more important. Racism is the most important impact. They lose voter ID, they lose the round.
Let's say respond to terminal defense, they don't have access to any argument. So the first voting issue in the round is going to be voter turnout. You extend the word as to why voter turnout is higher in swing states because the perception of the vote matters. Extend the University of Minnesota that explains is that based on survey data, there is no perception of their vote meaning more in swing states. So that allows us to actually trend England turn on their case, which explains is that there is no correlation between being a swing state and having higher turnout. The second way we win turnout is often negative advertisements. This is a clean extension because they drop the Richard Law meta-analysis that explains that 65% of scholarly articles refer that negative advertisements suppress turnout. They never contest the link to negative advertisements. So if you believe voter turnout is important, you turn the argument. And I would also argue that when you have more voter turnout, you would solve backward things like racism because there's more representative policies. But then, the second voting issue is going to be terminal defense on racism. First, extend the Associated Press that explains that their only evidence they say is that whites have 37% more voting power. There's 2 problems with that. Firstly, during that same 16-year period, what you saw was that white people were 93% have less influence right now. Secondly, extend the fact that Brookings Institute explains is that what happens is that there was a 45% increase in the Hispanic population, so much so that they form voting blocks. But then we give you comparative analysis. Always prefer comparative analysis because it does specific comparison in the debate that we are making, and it finds that the Electoral College would actually be better for the rights of minorities. Then they try to extend voter ID laws. However, extend the terminal defense from Roosevelt, George Washington University is that voter ID laws are much more likely to occur under the national popular vote, and they never actually respond to that. But then, specifically on the idea of polarization, we link in two ways. First, we link in through the argument of negative advertisements. They never contest the link. So it's an Ingard of Stanford University that explains that negative advertisements increase polarization 14%. The second way we link in is to base center campaigning. Their only terminal defense they have on this argument is the moderate argument, and that 40% of voters are moderate. The Calabrero analysis answers this by saying is that they would actually have more appeal to base center campaigning that would draw moderates towards extreme policy. So that allows us to access the Epstein of Rand Corporation analysis is that the most polarized term results in 166% fewer policy. Policy see most significant impact because without policy you see no representation, and that's a terminal impact of every argument that they are reading. So we circumvent all of these arguments by putting gridlock, and for that reason I strongly urge a negative ballot.